Hey friends! Over the past 2 episodes, we've been checking in with you during this intense election season. Now that we're a little over a week past the announcement of the results, I know many of us are feeling a lot. Terror, heartache, anger, betrayal, disappointment, or perhaps even feeling numb, or excited, or vindicated, I guess. This is a tough season, and for many of our listeners, it's about to get even tougher. If you feel yourself bristling or wanting to turn off this podcast, please hear me. We're here to hold space for everyone, no matter where you are right now. Whether you're feeling hopeful or hopeless, victorious or defeated, you matter to us. And as an organization, we are called to confront abuse and to speak truth to abusive powers, to center and to tend to those most vulnerable to the trauma of abuse. In this spirit, we're about to begin a 2-part series where Dan and I will dive into the topic of spiritual abuse. After witnessing the power struggles, the deep divisions, and how often God's name has been wielded to put people in positions of power, my heart aches. And quite frankly, I'm furious. Now more than ever, we need to feel whole and be reminded of the image of God within us. Now more than ever, we need one another. Now more than ever, we need to go about the good work of healing and restoration. If you've experienced harm where God's name was used to undermine your worth, or where it has wounded your community, please know that here on this podcast and through our work at the Allender Center, we are fiercely committed to contending with the evil of spiritual abuse, both personally and collectively. We hope these conversations give you space to grieve, to feel seen, and to find strength as we move together toward healing. And we'll keep checking in. We're with you, and we're here for what comes next.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Don't need to remind you as an audience, but I am, that we are the Allender Center of Trauma and Abuse. And in that, we address often the reality of what it means to live in a fallen world where there's more than suffering. There's suffering that has come because of the intentionality of another to bring about some degree of debasement, of humiliation, of degradation, ultimately of harm. What we're going to do today is, again, enter into the realities that many, heartbreakingly, many have experienced in the context of the church, and larger, in the context even of parachurch organizations, and maybe even larger from the hands and the mouths of believers to other believers. And so as we deal with the category of spiritual abuse, we don't enter this conversation with harsh judgment against the church. On the other hand, there has to be an honorable entry into telling the truth. And we don't address these matters to presume that a podcast provides sufficient balm and healing to be able to address all the realities that have come to many of you. Yet, we also know that by putting words to reality, there is an openness to what the Spirit wishes to do. So I know as we enter into this, Rachel, this has been a realm of immense, shall we say, importance, but passion on your part. And before we get much further, I just want you to be able to put words to why it is one of your central callings, one of the
Mm.
hell no and heaven yeses of your life?
Hmm. No, it's a great question. And some of what we're going to talk about in this particular conversation is how the harm of spiritual abuse is very pervasive and holistic, but at its core, it is such a wound on our attachment, our capacity to trust, to belong, to connect with ourselves, with God, and certainly with other people. And, we can talk more. It's such a misuse and exploitation of power and authority, often with this kind of emphasis on like God-given authority, which is why it plays out in churches and parachurch organizations and education systems and families. Um, Honestly, it wasn't until we had a podcast conversation initially on spiritual abuse in 2018 that the language of spiritual abuse came to be something I would have said, yes, that's it. You asked me to be a part of that conversation, and I was like, sure. Like I'm doing this. I could have said, I love working with trauma survivors and how that impacts their spiritual formation. That was very clear to me. I could have said, in our trainings and work I was doing in story workshops and recovery weeks, I am deeply passionate about working with people who have been harmed in the context of faith and, like where they've encountered in really many ways a false image of God or a false name of God or a false experience of God. But something about that podcast we did, I began to share aspects of my story. And it was one of those, like, I know we've talked about how you've had these moments in your own work and like connection to vocational work, where it's like, oh my God, like as we were talking, it was very much like a spiritual abuse is a core part of my story.
Yeah.
That's not a connection I would have said, "Oh yeah, I'm recovering from fundamentalism. I know something of abuse. I'm an abuse survivor." Um, all these things I would have named, but to see how they came together in this language of spiritual abuse was kind of a profound awakening for me. And I think at my core, I just I just refuse to let bad shepherds, bad theology, um, worldly like addiction to worldly powers, weaponizing and wielding of like wicked power to get to have the final say on what I believe is actually like this language I've been using, do with it what you will, like our connection to God and our attachment to God in our innermost being is actually a part of like our divine birthright of being made in the image of God. So there's something I feel just incredibly fiercely passionate about when that innocence, that way in which we are wired for connection, for trust, for belonging gets violated, gets distorted, gets disordered, and gets exploited.
No.
So,
Amen. Well, I remember only too well the, shall we say, the light in your eyes and face as you were beginning in that podcast to name some of the realities. And it was both holy, uh, but at one level, not surprising because most of us don't choose the passions that we bring into living out the kingdom of God. I think most of us stumble into it,
yeah.
almost like we get caught and then in it, we begin to acknowledge, yes, I have to speak about this.
Mhm.
And I'm so grateful that you have done so. And we'll put more words to it in a moment or two, but I do want people to know, glory be to God. You and I will say I was privileged to be part, but a number of others were privileged as well to join you. But you are the prime voice on a new online course addressing the issue of spiritual abuse. So, even though I've said already that one podcast is not enough, an online course is not enough,
No.
but it's the open door to begin to language because we will not change what we cannot name. We have to
Mhm.
name in order for transformation. So, so proud of you. So,
Oh,
so
thank you.
proud of you for shall we say, allowing a podcast to open your own eyes, and then over many years, faithfully moving into that. But I want to come back to that category of that in some sense, all spiritual abuse is a kind of attachment wound because it is a violation of some of the most holy categories of trust.
That's right. Oh, that's right. Yeah. And I think that that's, you know, and this is true. I mean, we know, like we've said, any form of abuse is inherently spiritually abusive because the nature of abuse involves a violation of trust. So, that can be a confusing thing because it's like, well, how do you parse out what is? Um, but I find that that's something that the invitation most of us feel when we start to contend with our abuse is like a splitting off of the parts of us that that trusted as dangerous, stupid, foolish, and evil loves to kind of speak into this too. Um, like somehow it was our fault. Like if we had been less naive, if we had less desire, um, you know, then we would not have been violated or abused in the ways that we were. And I just feel such deep convictions that like those parts of us again are really core to being human. And and so that's why similar to any form of healing, you can just split those parts of you off. And sometimes we need to do that for a season, right? Like we just need a break from feeling so vulnerable, and we need space to kind of, like you said, name what's happened to us and get clarity. And yet I don't think it's a sustainable ending point. And we can start with the abuse and say, well, that's where, the wound came. But I also think we have to look even further back to some of our own developmental trauma or ways we were formed in our primary care provider relationships to attach or to negotiate trust. Because the reality is, and we'll talk more about this, but any abuser um, is reading well the vulnerabilities of the people that they are looking to harm. And even if the harm is more, I wouldn't say innocent, but like I think a lot of spiritual abuse actually comes from like good intentions in the sense of we've talked about this in the online course through, thankfully from Rebecca Vickery, one of our instructors gave us this language of like reenactment, abuse, where people are really just working out of their own attachment wounds, their own wounds to try to find some kind of certainty, to try to like prevent chaos that maybe they knew, but then will turn to really rigid structures or whatever. So whether the wounds we're looking at in our primary formation were coming out of like wicked abuse, intentional harm, or just where we have wounds that shape us and shape how we relate to the world, that can be some really beautiful, helpful work intending to parts of us that were vulnerable before the abuse even began. I do want to make a caveat that for some people, the spiritual abuse they've experienced was playing out in their home, in their family of origin. And so it's not like two separate things, it's like one and the same.
Well, and we need to be able to say that sometimes the spiritual abuse occurs in a one-to-one relationship. Sometimes it is more, shall we say, familial in the context of how a family orients their fear and anger regarding sexuality or
Hmm.
regarding so-called secularism, and
Hmm.
how the bondage into a kind of you have to do X if you're going to be loved by God. So familial, but yet we're also talking about the reality that in a larger systemic sense, that churches, through individuals and through systems, can obviously do great harm. I just even as we're talking, I remember a particular person, unimportant who it was, told me at the very beginnings of my work in sexual abuse that they said they had been praying for me, and God had let them know that this was a really dangerous and false path that would take
Oh.
me into a misuse of my understanding of the gospel and my ability to proclaim it. And I remember, because this was a very significant person in my life, it wasn't just a casual relationship. Um, it, it, again, when someone brings God with certainty into a radical demand that you alter something of the direction of your life that clearly is not a moral category. I'm not at that point doing something clearly wrong, but nonetheless, the imposition of God having told them as to what I could or should not do, it was uh, for a long period at the beginning of my work. This was before writing The Wounded Heart. I felt that what I just want to call, like, there was something of bile in my throat,
Uh,
something of that nausea of I don't want to
mhm.
violate what God wants,
Oh,
but
yeah.
I feel called to engage this, and yet somebody else's reading of me and reading of God on my behalf did feel intrusive, violating, and, again, though I wouldn't put it into some of the worst experiences I've had within the broader range of the believing community, it was really a tough one to work through.
Mm. Well, and you can say no to answering any of these questions, but there's a part of me that's really curious if there was a way in which this person had a particular power because of some of the wounds that you had from earlier in your life, and if that's something you've thought about with regard to this particular person or not, or if it just felt like because of, your trust in them and respect in them.
Well, it was someone I would have put in a constellation that I would call a mentor.
Mhm.
Somebody who had invested, and I did love and respect. So it wasn't something easily just dismissed. But if you start looking at attachment wounds, what I would say is, my core ambivalence was being lived out with a mom who's borderline. But
Mhm.
underneath that, or around it, or above it, or below it, is a very absentee father,
Mhm.
who was a very gracious man, but also cowardly. And as a
Mhm.
consequence, left me so susceptible to the devouring presence of my mom. So I can easily say over a long period of my life, 20, 30 years, I was hungry for a mentor, for a father. And this man was in the broad range of a father figure who, to have someone whom I loved and respected, shadowing something of what I sensed to be my calling. Yeah, it was, again, the bile, even as we talk, I can
Mhm.
it's like, "Oh, yeah, yep, it's still there." Not not in the level of severity. A lot's been worked through, but yeah, individuals, families, systems, can shadow us even decades later, where I have no question in the universe that indeed I was and am privileged to address sexual abuse. Uh, but to do that, there were obstacles that were put in
Mhm.
my way that, I do not believe were of God.
Mm. Well, and I'm just even just feeling the ache then of the grief of giving up, to be faithful to call and to say yes to Jesus, to have to say no in some ways to a beloved mentor who's and saying, I'm going to choose to basically, in some ways, betray you and probably lose access to you in order to be faithful. And those are pretty profound levels of grief.
Yeah, the
Um,
relationship was never the same.
mm,
And in that, the sensibility again of going back to how such deep parts of us have longed for life, connection, loyalty in the relationship, particularly with non-blood family,
Mhm.
our church, our community. And I think as I look over my experience of, um, an ecclesial experience since I've been about 23, 24 years of age, there have been a lot of betrayals, and those feel at times more haunting than even, uh, I want to say it carefully here, but somehow at times more haunting than even the experience of past sexual abuse.
Mhm. Well, there's something about the, like, ways in which, we talk about attachment a lot at the Allender Center. A lot of this language was developed between you and Abby Wong Hefter over many years in our trainings, but we talk about how we're made for attunement. We're made for that sense of being anticipated, delighted in, nurtured and soothed, like, an empathetic witness who, is with us, not just in the joy, but also in the suffering. And we're made for honor. And that sense of our personhood, the way I've heard you talk about containment, being made for containment is like, I have enough capacity to make space for your beauty and your brokenness. Like, who you are as a person is not too much for me. I'm just going to say, as the mother of a toddler who's thinking a lot about attachment categories, this is hard. It's hard. Okay. Because I am trying to honor her personhood. I am trying to make space for her beauty and her brokenness. And she is a powerful human being. And I got my own trauma. So I have a lot of moments where I'm like, I'm not sure I'm doing great at containment, but what I know about good enough parenting is you only need to be good at it one third of the time, and you have to learn how to repair. But protection, a sense of not only can I make space for the fullness of who you are, but I will also be committed to holding the boundary lines when you don't yet have enough wisdom or discernment to, like, understand the danger. And then again, repair that sense of, like, when harm is done, intentional or not, like, I will make things right. I will do the work to rebuild trust. Other biblical language, repentance, accountability, reconciliation. Like, this is not unfamiliar language for us. But this is actually not just like, oh, emotionally we're meant for these things, which would be a truth no matter what. But it's actually how our neurological, biochemical framework is why, like, it's how God actually made us from like our cells and our being. And that's why, like, just isolating and cutting off relationship and really feeling the shame of our vulnerability, um just can't be the stopping point, because at the end of the day we're wired to need other human beings in order to survive. And it's
Mm,
so frustrating, as much as it's redemptive and glorious and beautiful.
yeah, and let's complicate it. Not that we haven't already, but the reality is that if you, as a believer, have been able to meander or walk through your own ecclesial experience and not know something of spiritual abuse, you are rare. But what we're also saying is it's not enough to just deal with the most recent betrayal or the experience of harsh or cruel or violating interactions. The the fact is that so much of what we're experiencing, maybe in the here and now,
Mhm.
has its own story and history, which is why our beloved Rebecca Vickery spoke about reenactment, that
Mhm.
we're actually seeing and experiencing in the failure in the present, other wounds. So, in some sense, it's the echo
Mhm.
of the past in the present that intensifies something of the nature of the violation, which sounds like we're making it worse, not better. We're asking more of you, not less, to deal with not only the here and now or the recent, but also the foundational traumas, developmental or directly violating, that indeed are echoing into the present. And that's back to that whole point. If we don't name it, then we may be making it bigger than it was, but in one sense, by putting our arms around through language what's actually happening in us, we may have more to deal with, but we actually can now see it and engage it rather than having it behind us and
Yeah.
haunting us.
Well, and I'll just give an example from my lived experience as to like, why are we talking about this? This is vulnerable. And I'm going to bring story that I don't have time to nuance in a way that I would most want to. But I just want to give an example of why we're talking about this. I could say in my experience, I probably had, a much more disorganized attachment in my primary, in my earliest beginnings, like some of the most beautiful memories of childhood and also like often a beautiful memory simultaneously holding excruciating fear or terror or pain. And so learning to navigate my world with a lot of I want to be good so that I can help mitigate the trauma that's playing out. That's a lot of generational trauma, so that I can make sure my big people get the care they need so that I can get some care I need. And and I came into faith or spirituality around 4. And my parents made really great decisions about like our early spiritual formation. They were a part of the Jesus movement. They got saved in the Jesus movement of the late 70s, early 80s, and like, coming out of faith traditions. They both were raised in the church and mainline churches, but had this radical encounter with Jesus. But the group they were a part of was like, got like hyper charismatic and was like, we're all moving to Tulsa because Jesus is coming back. And that's my parents, were like, in all their human sizeness, we're like, we're not going. That's like, this is the boundary line for us. And so they wanted to find a church that had a really good kids program. So we became a part of a Southern Baptist church in Stillwater, Oklahoma, that was like near the university. And I can honestly say that spiritual formation for me was very secure. Like my
Mhm.
attachment to God, like an example I often give is like in Vacation Bible School when I was like 4 or 5, I was very troubled that in some of the ways salvation was talked about, like I had accepted Jesus into my heart, but I didn't have this like radical transformation of my humanity. And, as a 4-year-old, I was taking that very literally, so I was like, I'm still, making bad choices and I don't think it worked. And I had a teacher who said something like, it's not really about you asking Jesus into your heart. It's about you being wrapped into the heart of God and the story of God. And I was like, oh, okay, I like that. That sounds better. Um, and so, very beautiful for the most part, secure attachment with God until, certainly immersed in a larger cultural of fundamentalism, which we'll talk about in the next conversation. However, by the time I got into high school, which you can go back and listen to other podcasts we've done on this, we found ourselves in a very, you know, very I'm not gonna say conservative. It was like very fundamentalism, like a church that had like very rigid boundaries of who's in and who's out, a lot of fear of, like secularism, very gendered patriarchal norms. I shared about, how when I was a teenager, I was set up in relationship with one of my youth leaders. But the truth is that power differential between men and women in romantic relationships was actually like a very pervasive part of the whole community and culture. And that 4 years of intense fundamentalism had the power to completely dismantle and distort my attachment with God and my understanding of who God was. And it wasn't just because like I had a moment of weakness, it's because I had parts of my story that had shaped me to want to conform to whatever the culture was to be good so that I
Mhm.
can be loved and belong. And that has helped me make more sense of how this community had so much power to bring so much harm so quickly after so many years of a really beautiful spiritual formation that I'm so grateful for because I think it's part of the grace I have that allows me to do this work on behalf of others, that I have some memory of goodness to call upon, as I've had to really reclaim and recover a sense of who God is in the wake of that. And then the grace of many years of theological education that allowed me to kind of reclaim aspects of my mind that honestly were pretty intact to some degree until this very particular season. And so I share that to say that's part of why we have to take a deeper look at these wounds that make us vulnerable. It doesn't mean, and I think this is true with any form of abuse. And in part, it's because we need to make a shift to talk about grooming, because part of the reality of any form of abuse is like the role of grooming in inviting us in some ways to feel complicit in our own harm. And grooming, I would love for you, Dan, to talk a little bit more about it. But when I think about grooming, I think about it as attunement without honor. So it's that, and that definitely typically involves a power dynamic, even if you have people of the same age or same gender, but maybe there's the power dynamic is innocence. There's
Oh,
a
it's
lack,
so.
a loss of
Oh,
innocence and innocence. So it's that sense of like, our attachment wounds, our wounds are read really well, our developmental trauma wounds that might extend beyond attachment, right? Like some of the supremacy structures are oppressive structures that maybe we were exposed to socioeconomically, racially, with regard to our sexuality. So it's like, it's not just our family of origin that impacts these wounds that can be read well by others, but it's just that sense of these most precious and glorious parts of us that are hungry, get read really well and then exploited in a way that makes us feel really complicit in the harm we've experienced, which makes it harder then to untangle and to heal and to make sense of.
well, let's start with one simple word: performance as the basis of our ontology, performance as the basis of whether or not we are beloved. So our doing defines our being. When that's the case, you are being groomed. So that in one sense, you be a good girl, and then you get the accolades of what your body and heart was made for. But what if you're not a particularly good girl at a moment when there's withdrawal, when there is a shaming, again, I'm not opposed to discipline, but when there is that violation at the core, you are no longer loved, then you are set up. That is in and of itself a setup that is a grooming to be quote unquote good. I think a lot of Christians grow up being groomed to be good. And if they're able to achieve it, then frankly, the byproduct is usually more pride and self righteousness. But most of us know that we can't do that. And therefore, we have now hidden parts of us. And
Uh-huh.
those hidden parts feel real, and the external feels to some degree real but unreal. And so we live in this internal contradiction, which then demands, if you can see the cycle, even more hiding, even more pretense, even more, frankly, performance. So that's the beginning structure of grooming that is much more systemic and yet very personal. But then we just have to say that there are those within the believing community who understand that this is a place where they can use and violate with a degree of impunity. Therefore, the grooming actually is far more not just a bad theology, it's actually an intention to steal, to steal your innocence. And obviously, at the point I'm making, I'm reflecting on John 10:10, which again, the passage is not about directly about Satan, though it includes all forms of evil. It's about bad leaders. And so bad leaders steal. They take away and own for themselves what should be left for you. And then, of course, there is a kind of murder, a killing, a taking away, but then a violating. And ultimately, the final word is marring. So if we can begin to talk about grooming as how does that person steal from you your innocence? How do they kill the capacity of freedom and hope and imagination? And then how do they mar you with shame? Those categories are the realm of grooming. And for many of us, I didn't encounter the church until after I had some degree of interest in the gospel. And th- I don't know what to say about it other than so often I have thanked God that my family, as much as there was failure, never have I had to, in one sense, disentangle my mother and father from my relationship with God, not directly. And that has been a relief in some ways. I think I was spared a certain amount of innocence being stolen because I didn't have the overlapping realms of the church and family being so, in one sense, mired together. But in your experience, and we'll use this as a launch for where we go next time. In your experience, you had chaotic attachment, and then a deep, secure attachment, and then a deep, deep violation and violations. And so I want to step back into the category of how is it that in the midst of all that spiritual abuse, um, that something of the living presence of Jesus remained. And I think that's, well, we're not trying to offer a quick solution, but there is something, even for those who have been abused, where the reality of their own spirituality can be re engaged in order for a movement into the goodness of God in the land of the living. And I want to make sure that we enter more deeply into that.
To me, this is such a mysterious place and a place that can feel painful and agonizing as I work with other people. Because it is a place that I kind of feel like, yeah, this is God's work. Like if God is God, then like God better show up and follow through on those promises that there's nothing that could separate us from the love of God, even like the abuse we've experienced and the ways it's really harmed us and disordered us. I will say for me, enough of my righteous anger that actually was directed at God ultimately because of the ways everything that was happening to me was being named as happening from God. Like an actual rejection of that God. Like, you know what? At the end of the day, I always thought it would be like I stayed in this dynamic, even though everything was telling me I don't want this because I didn't want to lose you. But you know what? I'm feeling suicidal. I'm feeling like I don't want to live if I have to stay in this dynamic. So actually, if that's what you want from me, I have decided I don't want you. So where that kind of strength came from, I can only say watching my 2-year-old, I think it was just in me. And that was definitely directed at God and many others.
Mhm.
And I would love to say that that was, I entered a season of a lot of restorative recovery that feels very mystical to me. I still don't have a lot of language for. And then shortly following that, experienced probably my most painful spiritual abuse from a narcissist, in a church camp setting. That actually, whatever shreds of innocence I had left and trust and faith ultimately were just completely annihilated. And so it's like I would love to say, oh, I just, and that recovery period, you know, worked in perpetuity and I wasn't drawn in by any other abusers, but that was not the case for me because I had to do a lot more deeper healing work about other realities of my life. But, I've felt a pursuit and a sense of a very patient, very kind God who also is filled with rage at injustice and is very merciful in comfort.
Indeed. And so to go back to reenactment, we often we often perpetuate, unwittingly, cycles of structure, that continue to bring heartache and harm. And in that, we're not at fault, and not like, "You wicked little sinner." but it's a matter of eventually the debris becomes so substantial that at one level we can't slide it underneath the couch. We can't sort of put it in the closet because it's just overwhelming our home, our very heart, our very body.
Well, at, and this is a good link to where we'll go next, because the reality is, yes, there was like interpersonal grooming. There was theological grooming, but the reality is part of that reenactment for me of being drawn to strong narcissistic leader churchmen was the cultural waters I was swimming in that were telling me you're a really strong, gifted woman, and that's bad if you want to be loved by a faithful follower of Jesus. And so you have to find someone even more powerful than you, more gifted than you, smarter than you, more charismatic than you to be a covering. Again, there were developmental wounds that were shaping me towards these reenactments, and there were cultural developmental wounds that were almost making it impossible for me to even perceive another way and another imagination. And that's part of the spiritually abusive realities we want to talk about next. But anything you would add, Dan, before we bring this conversation to a close?
Oh, just again, marvel, marvel over the goodness of God. Marvel over your ferocious and tender heart. And so glad that though I have not borne the same scars, that in so many ways your integrity, seen in the course, seen in this labor, is such an invitation to a different kind of redemption.
Thank you.
You can find out much more about the spiritual abuse and healing online course by visiting theallendercenter.org. I hope you'll join us in this journey to healing and hope.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.